Rain had been falling over the small town of Millbrook for 3 days straight, and Clara Bennett had almost stopped noticing it. She stood at the kitchen window of her cramped 2-bedroom rental, watching water run in gray rivers down the cracked driveway, and she thought, not for the first time that week, that she was tired in a way sleep could never fix. She was 34 years old. She had a 9-year-old son named Eli who was, at that very moment, doing his homework at the kitchen table with a particular stubbornness only a 9-year-old can summon over long division. She had a job at the diner on 5th Street that paid just enough to keep the lights on and not quite enough to keep the refrigerator from humming with worry every time it kicked on. And she had, if she was honest with herself in the quiet hours after Eli fell asleep, a growing and persistent fear that she would grow old and gray in this same kitchen alone, having spent her whole life keeping everyone else afloat while no one ever came to keep her afloat in return. It hadn't always felt this heavy. There had been a time, a decade ago, when Clara believed the world owed her nothing but was still going to be kind to her anyway, the way the world is sometimes kind to the young and the hopeful. She had been 24 then, newly married to a man named Daniel Bennett, who had a crooked smile and a habit of humming old country songs while he fixed things around the house. They had a baby on the way. They had a small apartment with a leaky faucet they never got around to fixing because they were always laughing about something else. And then, 8 months into Eli's life, Daniel was gone. A car accident on Route 9, black ice. A curve he'd driven 100 times before. Clara had buried her husband in the same week she'd been planning his surprise birthday party. And after that, the years had simply happened to her rather than being lived by her. She raised Eli alone. She worked double shifts. She learned to fix the leaky faucet herself, and 100 other things besides, because there was no one else to do it, and somewhere in all that learning and doing and surviving, she had quietly buried the part of herself that used to believe good things were still coming. So when the knock came at her door that Thursday evening, in the middle of the rain, Clara almost didn't answer it. She assumed it was Mrs. Alvarez from next door, coming to complain about the drainage again, or maybe someone selling something nobody in this neighborhood could afford. But Eli, ever curious, was already halfway to the door before she could stop him, and by the time she caught up, he had it open, and standing on the porch, dripping wet under a black umbrella that had clearly lost its battle with the storm, was a man Clara had never seen before in her life. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair plastered to his forehead and kind, tired eyes that studied her for a long moment before he spoke. "Are you Clara Bennett?" he asked. "Clara Whitfield, before you married?" Clara felt something cold move through her chest, the particular dread of a stranger who knows your maiden name. "Yes," she said carefully, one hand instinctively moving to rest on Eli's shoulder, pulling him gently behind her. "Who's asking?" "My name is Walter Hayes," the man said. "I used to work with your father. A long time ago." He reached into his coat, careful to keep it out of the rain, and produced a small bundle wrapped in plastic, the kind of careful wrapping a person uses for something they've protected for years. "I'm sorry to come without calling. I didn't have a number for you, only this old address, and I wasn't even sure you'd still be here. But I've been carrying something that belongs to you for a very long time, and I promised someone I would deliver it, no matter how long it took me to find you." Clara's father, David Whitfield, had died when she was 21, 3 years before she'd even met Daniel. He had been a quiet, hard-working man who ran a small engine repair shop, and their relationship had been loving but simple, unremarkable, the kind of steady presence a daughter doesn't fully appreciate until it's gone. He had died of a heart attack in his own garage on a Tuesday afternoon, and Clara had grieved him the way you grieve a parent who was simply, always, there, and then suddenly wasn't. She had never imagined, in the 13 years since, that he had left behind anything she didn't already know about. "I don't understand," she said, still standing in the doorway, rain misting in sideways to dampen the welcome mat. "What is it?" "A letter," Walter said. "He wrote it about 10 years before he passed, when you were still a teenager. He asked me to hold on to it and give it to you if anything ever happened to him before he could give it to you himself. I was supposed to find you within a year of his passing. I failed at that. I'm ashamed to admit I let too much time slip by. I had my own troubles, my own family falling apart around the same time, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I lost track of where you'd gone. I've been looking for the better part of the last 2 years, ever since my own health scare reminded me I might run out of time to make good on a promise." Clara stood frozen for a moment, Eli's small shoulder warm and solid under her hand, rain drumming on the porch roof, and something in her chest cracked open in a way she hadn't expected and didn't have words for yet. She invited Walter inside. He sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Eli's math homework was still spread out, and he handed her the plastic-wrapped bundle with the careful reverence of a man handing over something sacred. Inside was an envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, her name written across the front in her father's unmistakable handwriting. The same slanted, deliberate script that used to sign her school permission slips and write out grocery lists taped to the refrigerator. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. Eli, sensing the weight of the moment in the way children sometimes do, climbed quietly into the chair beside her and simply watched, uncharacteristically still. The letter was 3 pages long, and Clara read it twice before she could bring herself to look up. Her father had written it not long after her mother left them both, when Clara was 14 and furious and certain the whole world was built out of people who eventually walked away. He wrote about how he'd watched her build walls around herself that year, how he'd worried about who she would become if she carried that fear of abandonment into her adult life. He wrote that he didn't know how to say these things to her out loud without it becoming a lecture that she'd roll her eyes at and forget by dinner, so instead he was writing them down, to be given to her someday, whenever life had tested her hardest, whenever she most needed to hear it. He wrote that he had made an investment years earlier, in a small parcel of land out past the county line, land that had been worthless scrub brush when he bought it but that he suspected, based on nothing but a hunch and some talk down at the hardware store, might someday be worth something, if the town ever grew in that direction. He wrote that he wasn't leaving it to her outright, not yet, because he wanted her to have to ask for it, to have to reach out and want it, rather than simply inherit it passively the way people inherit things they never think to be grateful for. He'd set it up, quietly, through a small trust with an old friend and lawyer named Walter Hayes, so that it would only be released to her if she came looking, if life had gotten hard enough that she needed reminding that her father had been thinking of her future long after he was gone. But more than the land, more than any money it might be worth, he wrote about her worth. He wrote, in words Clara would read 100 more times over the coming weeks until she'd nearly memorized them, that she was the kind of person who gave everything to everyone around her and forgot to save any for herself, and that this was both her greatest strength and the thing most likely to break her if she wasn't careful. He wrote that whatever had happened in her life by the time she read this letter, whatever losses, whatever hardships, he wanted her to know that she was never, not for one single day, meant to carry it all alone. He wrote that love doesn't always arrive on schedule. Sometimes it takes 10 years, sometimes it takes an old friend with a bad memory and a guilty conscience showing up soaking wet at your door. But it arrives. He asked her to believe that, even when the arriving felt impossibly late. Clara set the letter down on the table and put both hands over her face, and for a moment she simply cried, the kind of crying that comes not from a single wound but from years of them, all breaking open at once. Eli, without being told, reached over and put his small hand on her arm, and Walter, respectful of the moment, quietly excused himself to the front porch to give her privacy. Standing there in the rain rather than intrude on grief, he understood he had no right to witness up close. When Clara finally composed herself enough to call him back in, she asked the question that had been sitting underneath all of it. "Is it still there? The land?" Walter nodded. "It's still there. And Clara, I should tell you, the town did grow that direction, about 6 years ago. There's a shopping development gone up not far from it. A new highway exit 2 miles down. I had it appraised last month, once I finally tracked down your old landlord who pointed me toward this address. It's worth considerably more now than your father ever imagined it might be." He named a figure, and Clara had to ask him to repeat it, certain she'd misheard. She hadn't misheard. It was not the kind of money that changes a person's life in the movie sense, not a private island or an early retirement to somewhere with palm trees, but it was the kind of money that changes a life in the real sense, the sense that mattered to a woman who counted quarters for the laundromat and skipped meals some weeks so Eli wouldn't have to. It was enough to pay off the small, suffocating debts that had piled up after Daniel died. It was enough for a down payment on a house with a yard, Something Eli had asked for every birthday since he'd turned 6. It was enough, if she was careful and smart about it, the way her father had raised her to be careful and smart about everything, to go back to school part-time, finish the nursing degree she'd abandoned when she got pregnant, build something sturdier under her feet than a diner job that would never quite be enough. But more than any of it, more than the money and the house and the degree that would follow over the next several years, Clara found herself returning, again and again in the months that came after, to the words in that letter rather than the numbers on the appraisal. She kept the letter in the drawer of her nightstand, and on the nights when the loneliness crept back in, when Eli was asleep and the house was quiet and the old fear that she would spend her whole life alone came scratching at the door of her mind the way it always had, she would take it out and read it again, and something in her would settle. Walter Hayes became, in an unexpected way, a fixture in their lives after that. He had no family of his own left nearby, a wife who'd passed some years back, children scattered across the country and not much given to calling, and he found himself, almost without meaning to, drawn into the orbit of Clara and Eli's small household. He came for dinner some Sundays. He taught Eli how to fish, the way he said her father used to talk about wanting to teach her, back before life got busy and then simply ran out. He was, Clara came to realize, not a replacement for anything she'd lost, but something new entirely. Proof, delivered 10 years late but delivered all the same, that the people who loved you sometimes left pieces of that love scattered along your path for you to find long after they themselves were gone, and that the world, despite every reason she'd had to stop believing it, was still capable of arranging its own quiet kindnesses. It was almost a year later, on a bright October afternoon with the leaves turning gold along the new street where Clara and Eli now lived in a small house with an actual yard, that Clara found herself sitting on the front porch step, watching Eli race around with a neighbor's dog, when a car she didn't recognize pulled slowly to the curb. A man stepped out, tall, sandy-haired, maybe 40, with a slightly lost expression of someone checking house numbers against a piece of paper in his hand. He introduced himself as Marcus, a contractor who'd been hired to give an estimate on the fence Clara had been meaning to have built for months, the referral having come through Walter, who seemed to know everyone in 3 counties. Marcus was easy to talk to in a way that surprised her, unhurried, genuinely interested in Eli's opinions about where the dogs should be allowed to dig, and when he came back 2 weeks later to actually build the fence, he stayed for dinner afterward because Eli insisted, and Clara found she didn't mind the insisting one bit. It would be dishonest to say it was love at first sight, the kind of thing that resolves itself in a single golden afternoon. It wasn't. It was slower than that, and more careful, the way anything worth keeping tends to be when it's built by 2 people who have both already learned, the hard way, what it costs to lose something. But over the following year, in small unhurried increments, a fence built, a dinner shared, a boy who started asking when Marcus was coming back. Something steady grew between them, the kind of steady Clara hadn't let herself imagine wanting again. On the 2nd anniversary of the night Walter Hayes had knocked on her door in the rain, Clara sat at her kitchen table. A different table now, in a different house, though she'd kept the letter itself in the very same worn envelope, and she wrote a letter of her own. Not to anyone in particular, not yet, but simply to put down in words what she wanted to remember. She wrote that she had spent a decade believing she would grow old and alone, that the world had used up whatever kindness it owed her the day Daniel died on Route 9, and that she had been wrong. She wrote that sometimes the people who love you plant something long before you ever need it, and it waits, patient and quiet, for exactly the moment you're ready to receive it. She wrote that Eli was thriving, that she had finished her nursing prerequisites and would start clinical rotations in the spring, that Walter still came for Sunday dinners and had, without either of them ever quite naming it, become something like the grandfather Eli had never had. And she wrote, with a small private smile she couldn't quite explain even to herself, that a man named Marcus had asked her, the week before, in the unhurried and steady way that seemed to define everything about him, whether she might consider a future together. Not a rushed one, not a desperate one, but a real one, built slowly and carefully, the way good things are supposed to be built. She folded the letter and placed it in the same drawer where her fathers had waited patiently for 10 years, and she thought, as she closed the drawer and went to call Eli in for dinner, that perhaps this was the truest thing her father had ever taught her, more than any land or any money. That love left behind doesn't disappear just because the person carrying it is gone. It waits. It finds its way, however long it takes, however unlikely the messenger, to the person who needs it most. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and brave enough to keep the door open even after years of believing no one is coming, it arrives soaking wet on your porch in the middle of a rainstorm, carrying a decade-old promise that was never really about the money at all. It was about a father who had refused, even in death, to let his daughter believe for one more day that she would ever truly be alone.